Hürtgen Forest, German-Belgian border, November 12, 1944. The forest does not make a sound, it absorbed es. The snow, a fresh, wet powder, is a blanket draped over einen corpse. It clings to the dense furs, it softened the jagged outlines of shattered tree stumps, it muffles die Fußfalle auf der two men moving through the gloaming. Die Air ist kalt genug, einem Manns Zähne zu eken. Eine dampfpenetrierende Kälte, das seebt durch Woll und Leder und setzt tief in den Boden. Es schmelzt von Pein, Wetterde und Vier. To the east, the battle growls. A low, persistent thunder, das ist no longer a sound, but a physical vibration, fällt in den Sohlen der Feet. It is the sound des amerikanischen First Army feeding itself, man by man, into den meat grinder der Siegfriedlein. A battle of attrition, das ist, according to the planners in ihren warmen Map-Rumen, a foregone conclusion. But here, in den Schattens bezwischen den Armies, a different war is being fought. It is a war of whispers, of static, of ghosts. The two men are not soldiers. They wear die Rufe, fieldgraue Wolle der deutschen Foresters. Their papers sind perfekt, der Akzente flawless. But the tools they carry are not for forestry. Ein Mann unschlingst ein heavy verdant pace und setzt es carefully in der Snow. Der andere reint einen dünnen Kupferweiher, eine delikate Antenne und stringt es bezwischen zwei low-hanging branches. They move mit der kleinen, praktischen Ökonomie von Männern, die knowen, dass ein single-snappter Twig kann eine Todesurteil sein. They are hunting a phantom. Vor 6 Wochen, Allied Command hat es in einem Staat von quiet, controlled panic. The war is being lost, not in the mud of the front lines, but in the ether. Ein invisibler, omniscienter enemy scheint deren every move zu watchen. Die Germans know things, die sie should not know, they cannot know. 2 Wochen genau, a flight of P-74 Thunderbolts wurde dispatched to hit a newly identified supply depot behind the lines. Es war eine time-sensitive target, known nur zu einem Handvoll von Planern.
When the planes arrived, the depot was empty, the trucks were gone, but the flak batteries, moved into position just hours before, were not. They tore the flight to pieces. Last week, a resistance cell in Aachen, a group of veteran railway workers who had been disrupting German logistics for months, simply vanished. Not a firefight, not a single shot fired. One night they were there, the next, their safe house was empty, the doors left swinging in the winter wind. It was a surgical removal, an abduction so silent, it felt supernatural. The Allied system, the vast, complex machine of intelligence gathering, is breaking down. The human agents, the spies and saboteurs parachuted behind the lines, are being caught at a rate that is not just alarming, it is unsustainable. The life expectancy of an OSS operative in this sector has dropped from months to mere weeks. They are being hunted, not with dogs, not with patrols, but with an eerie, uncanny prescience. The official doctrine is that there is a leak, a high-level traitor, a mole buried deep inside SHAEF headquarters, feeding the German Abwehr the Allied order of battle. The counterintelligence officers are tearing London apart, looking for this phantom spy. But the two men in the forest know better. They are the listeners. They are part of a small, overlooked unit of the Royal Corps of Signals, specialists in radio direction finding. Their job is not to interrogate prisoners or cultivate sources. Their job is to listen to the air itself. And the air is telling them a different story. The man at the radio receiver puts on his headphones, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He adjusts the dial, a slow, patient turn. The headphones hiss with static, the sound of an empty universe. He is not listening for a voice, he is listening for a heartbeat, a faint, rhythmic pulse that appears on the airwaves for a few seconds at a time, at irregular intervals, and then vanishes. It is a signal unlike any other. It is too clean, too fast. It is not the clumsy tapping of a human operator. It is the sound of a machine. And for weeks, they have been chasing it, triangulation point by triangulation point, across the blasted landscape of occupied Europe. From Normandy to the outskirts of Paris, and now here, to this dark, frozen forest on the very edge of the Reich. The pulse appears. It is faint, a delicate, staccato burst. Bip, 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 bip. It lasts for less than 5 seconds. It carries no discernible message. It is just there, a ghost in the machine. The operator's hand shoots out, his fingers flying across his instruments, taking a bearing. His partner, watching a compass, takes another. They work without speaking. The signal is gone, vanished. The first man pulls off his headphones. He looks at his partner. His eyes are wide. They have a new line. And this line, crossed with their last two, does not point toward a military base. It does not point to a command bunker or a Gestapo headquarters. It points to a dead space on the map. A quiet, agricultural valley a dozen miles inside Germany. A place of no strategic value. A place of dairy farms, of rolling hills, of Nothing. This is the impossible problem. The German war machine seems to possess a sixth sense, a clairvoyant ability to anticipate Allied strategy. And the source of this power, the faint electronic heartbeat of this omniscience, is emanating from a place where nothing should be. This is not the story of a great battle. It is not the story of generals moving armies across a map. It is the story of a secret so vast and yet so cleverly hidden, it threatened to derail the entire Allied invasion of Germany. This is the story of how that secret was unraveled, not by an army, but by two men in a forest, following a signal that no one else believed was real. It is the story of what they found at the end of that signal, hidden in the most mundane, most normal, most unlikely of places.
A farmhouse. A discovery so shocking, so far beyond the known capabilities of technology, that the spies who found it could barely believe what they were seeing. To understand the farmhouse, you must first understand the crisis. By the autumn of 1944, the war in Europe had entered its most dangerous phase. The euphoria of D-Day and the liberation of Paris had evaporated, replaced by a grim, grinding reality. The Allied armies, after their spectacular race across France, had run out of steam. They had, in effect, outrun their own supply lines. The legendary Red Ball Express, the sprawling convoy of trucks running day and night from the Normandy beaches, was performing miracles, but it was not enough. The tanks needed fuel, the guns needed shells, the men needed food, ammunition, and winter clothing. At the tip of the spear, armies under Patton and Montgomery were stalled, bogged down in mud and blood at the German border. This was the strategic problem. The German Wehrmacht, which had seemed on the verge of total collapse in August, had performed a stunning recovery. Retreating to the formidable defenses of the Siegfried Line, pulling back onto their home soil, they were now fighting with a renewed savage ferocity. Every yard of German ground had to be purchased with Allied lives. The established Allied solution was air power and intelligence. The plan was to use the overwhelming might of the Allied air forces to smash German supply lines, to pulverize their industry, and to cripple their ability to wage war. To do this, they needed good targets, and for that, they needed good intelligence. This is where the system was failing. The intelligence picture, which had been so clear during the breakout from Normandy, was suddenly becoming opaque, cloudy. The two main pillars of Allied intelligence were Ultra, the decrypts of German Enigma traffic from Bletchley Park, and Humint, human intelligence from spies and resistance fighters on the ground.
Both were being systematically undermined. Ultra was a strategic miracle, but it had its limits. The Germans were constantly changing their codes and procedures. A decrypted message might give a priceless insight into German intentions, but that insight could be hours or even days old. For the tactical information a bomber pilot or a platoon commander needed, the location of a specific tank, the strength of a specific pillbox, Ultra was often too slow. For that, the Allies relied on people, on French and Belgian resistance fighters who counted the trains rumbling toward the front, on OSS and SOE agents, men and women of incredible bravery who lived in the shadows, reporting on troop movements and factory production. And now, these people were dying. The institutional arrogance was rooted in London and Paris. The high command at SHAEF, men who saw the war from 30,000 feet, were convinced the problem was one of classical espionage. They believed a German master spy, a new Mata Hari, had penetrated their headquarters. They saw the pattern of compromised operations and concluded it must be a human failure, their own human failure. The frantic mole hunt began, sowing suspicion and paranoia throughout the Allied command structure. They were looking for a person, for a motive, for a betrayal. They dismissed the alternative. Down in the technical branches, in the radio listening stations, a handful of signals intelligence officers were noting an anomaly, a series of strange, high-speed, non-Morse signals. They were weak, hard to pin down, and they seemed to be part of a vast, disciplined network. The reports were filed, sent up the chain of command, and largely ignored. It was considered technical noise, ghost signals, a German deception meant to distract them. The generals were looking for a traitor in a trench coat, not a phantom in the static. They were looking for a James Bond villain. The truth was infinitely more bureaucratic and far more terrifying. The ticking clock was the weather. Winter was coming to the Ardennes, the heavily forested, seemingly quiet sector of the front held by a thin screen of green American troops. The Allied High Command, obsessed with their own planned offensives, considered it a rest area, a place to season new divisions. Their intelligence reports, flawed and incomplete, confirmed this view. The Ardennes was quiet, too quiet. In reality, hidden under the canopy of the dense forests, shielded from the prying eyes of reconnaissance planes, the Germans were gathering for one last titanic gamble. Hitler was massing the best of his remaining panzer divisions for a surprise winter offensive, an armored blitzkrieg aimed at splitting the Allied armies in two and recapturing the vital port of Antwerp. It would be known as the Battle of the Bulge. If the German buildup went undetected, the result would be a catastrophe on a scale that could break the back of the Allied advance. The entire timetable for the end of the war was at stake. Hundreds of thousands of lives rested on the ability of Allied intelligence to see what was coming. And their eyes were being systematically poked out. Their ears were being deafened. Every resistance cell that could have reported the troop trains moving west was being rolled up. Every spy who could have warned of the new SS Panzer divisions arriving was being caught. The Germans were operating behind an almost perfect curtain of security. The established solution to keep sending in more agents was becoming a suicide pact. The mole hunters at SHAEF were chasing their own tails. The entire Allied intelligence apparatus was staring at a black hole, a massive, growing blind spot right at the most critical point on the entire Western Front. The system was failing because it was built on a flawed assumption. It assumed the enemy was playing the same game by the same rules. It assumed that intelligence was a human endeavor, a game of spies and secrets. It was not prepared for a machine that was systematic, that was inhumanly fast, and that was hiding in the most brilliant place of all. Not in a fortress, not in a bunker, but in plain sight. Its nerve center was not a steel and concrete complex. It was a place of stone and timber, of haylofts and manure piles, a place no one would ever think to look. The two men were Sergeant Alfred Withers and Corporal Shaw, and of the two, Withers was the one the system was designed to ignore. He was not a soldier. He wore the uniform, he held the rank, but his entire being was that of a civilian technician, a man accidentally misplaced in a war. Where other sergeants were hard, loud, and weathered, Withers was quiet, pale, and perpetually distracted. He was a tall, stooping man with thin wrists and the long, delicate fingers of a watchmaker. Before the war, he had worked for the BBC, not as a glamorous announcer, but deep in the bowels of the engineering department at Alexandra Palace, specializing in the arcane physics of high-frequency broadcast propagation. His war was not against men, but against static, against signal drift, against the sunspots and atmospheric whims that corrupted the pure, clean waves of information he revered. His commanding officer, a captain whose pre-war life had involved managing a Yorkshire textile mill, saw Withers as a necessary but irritating eccentric, a man who spoke a different language, a language of hertz and harmonics. He was a low-status specialist, a cog in the machine, valued for his technical skill but dismissed for his lack of military bearing. He was perpetually cleaning his spectacles, forever making meticulous, spidery notes in a logbook, and he possessed a maddening habit of staring into the middle distance, as if listening to a conversation no one else could hear. In a world of blunt instruments, of artillery and bayonets, Alfred Withers was a tuning fork. Shaw was his opposite, a short, pugnacious Londoner who understood the army perfectly. He followed orders, he kept his rifle clean, and he regarded the strange, pulsing signal they were chasing as just another job. It was Withers who was obsessed. It was Withers who lay awake at night in their freezing listening post, the headphones clamped over his ears, replaying the recordings of the signal over and over. This was his eureka moment. It was not a sudden flash, but a slow, dawning horror that had been building for weeks. Everyone else, from the analysts at Bletchley Park to his own captain, was trying to decipher the signal. They assumed it was a new form of enigma, a compressed code, a message hidden inside the electronic burst. They were trying to read the letter. Withers realized they were looking at the envelope. He sat in the back of their truck, the faint smell of ozone from the radio equipment mingling with the damp wool of their coats. He was looking at a photograph of the signal, a jagged peak on an oscilloscope display. Bip, 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 bip. It was perfect, too perfect. A human hand, no matter how skilled the operator, has a rhythm, a cadence, a signature. It has inconsistencies, tiny hesitations between the dits and daws. This signal had none. It was mathematically precise. The pulse lengths, the gaps between them, were exact to the millisecond, every single time. It was the work of a machine. And it was fast, inhumanly fast. A standard Morse transmission took time. Time to tap out, time to receive, time to write down. Time, most critically, for a direction-finding team to get multiple bearings and triangulate the source. This German signal was a phantom because it was designed to be. It existed for a handful of seconds, not long enough for the cumbersome Allied DF network, spread out over miles, to get a proper fix. It was a whisper in a hurricane. But Withers and Shaw were not a network. They were a two-man hunting party. They had been leapfrogging their listening post forward, getting closer and closer, their bearings becoming more and more acute. They were close enough now that they could get a rough fix from a single burst. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place for Withers as he listened to the growl of the truck's engine. It was the sound of a system, a network. He looked at the map, at the single point where their lines converged, the quiet, insignificant farming valley. The signal was not a spy talking to his handler. It was a node. It was a machine reporting to another machine. The Germans had not just built a better radio. They had built an automated electronic nervous system that overlaid the entire front. The spies and agents were not being caught by a clever German detective. They were being caught by an algorithm that was fed data from 1,000 listening posts, that collated the reports, and that dispatched the Gestapo with inhuman efficiency. And the heart of it all, the central brain, was located in a farmhouse. He took his discovery to his captain. It was, as he had expected, a complete disaster. The captain's command post was in a captured German bunker, the air thick with stale cigarette smoke and the smell of damp concrete. He listened, his face a mask of polite skepticism, as Withers, voice soft and earnest, laid out his theory. He spoke of machine-generated signals, of automated collation, of a central processing station hidden in a civilian setting. He pointed to the map, to the farmhouse. He argued that the mole hunt was a waste of time. They were not looking for a traitor. They were looking for a piece of technology no one believed the Germans possessed. The captain leaned back in his chair and laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the weary, patronizing laugh of a practical man confronted with what he believed was sheer fantasy. Withers, he said, you have been out in the cold too long. A thinking machine? In a barn? He gestured to the wall, to the charts showing Allied troop dispositions. This is the war, Sergeant. It is about men and mud and steel, not electric brains. Withers tried to argue. He showed the captain his logbook, the precise timings of the signal, the clean, mechanical nature of the transmission. Sir, the evidence is undeniable. It is not human. The captain's patience snapped. He told Withers his job was to find illegal transmitters, not to invent science fiction. The official word from headquarters was that they were dealing with a leak, and his unit was to continue monitoring for clandestine human operators. He dismissed the farmhouse as a fluke, a radio reflection from the nearby hills. He ordered Withers to drop his obsession with the ghost signal and get back to real work. The established leadership did not just dismiss the idea, they found it ridiculous. Withers was a technician, imagining a war of the future in the middle of a war of the present. He was told to stay in his lane. Withers walked out of the bunker into the gray, freezing afternoon, his face burning with a quiet, impotent rage. The system had looked at his discovery and had declared it noise. It was easier to believe in a single brilliant traitor than in a brilliant, anonymous machine. It was easier to accept a human failure than to confront the terrifying reality of a technological leap they couldn't comprehend. This was the catalyst. 2 days later, news filtered down the line. A network of Belgian railway workers, a vital source of intelligence on German troop movements toward the Ardennes, had gone silent. They had been using a low-powered transmitter, one Withers' unit was tasked to listen for. There had been no distress call, just silence. Withers knew with a sickening certainty what had happened. The ghost machine had heard them. It had triangulated their position with its ice-cold speed and precision, and the Gestapo had been sent. The system was not just wrong, it was getting people killed. The captain's refusal to listen, the high command's arrogant mole hunt, it was all a fatal diversion. The real enemy was the signal, and it was still out there, pulsing, listening, hunting. He made his decision that night, huddled with Shaw in the back of their truck. He was going to break the rules. It would not be a small infraction. He was going to commit a series of acts that could, if discovered, land him in a military prison. He was going to conduct his own, deeply unauthorized test. He could not go to the farmhouse, that was suicide. But he did not need to. If he was right, if this was a network, a machine talking to other machines, then it must have a protocol, a language, a digital handshake. He did not need to see the machine. He just needed to talk to it. His new tactic was not to listen. It was to transmit. He explained it to Shaw, his voice a low, urgent whisper. The German signal was always the same. Bip, 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 bip. It was a fixed pattern. Withers believed it was an identifier, a call sign. He believed the central machine, the one in the farmhouse, periodically sent out a query, and that the listening posts, the remote nodes of the network, would respond with their own data bursts. What if, he asked, we could pretend to be the central machine? What if we could send out that exact same call sign? Shaw stared at him. He said, you mean transmit? On their frequency? Al, that is insane. They will hear us. They will triangulate us in 30 seconds. Withers shook his head. No, they will not be looking for us. They will be looking for one of their own. We will not stay on the air. We will do exactly what they do. One burst, 5 seconds, a perfect replica. We will build a device, a keyer, that can replicate the signal's timing exactly. We will not be a clumsy human operator. We will be a ghost. This was the unauthorized test. For the next 24 hours, the two men became criminals. They cannibalized their own equipment. Withers, his watchmaker's fingers flying, modified a standard army transmitter. He bypassed the Morse key, building a complex, jury-rigged timing circuit, using salvaged capacitors and resistors. It was a crude, ugly device, a tangle of wires and solder, but he claimed it would work. It would create a single 5-second electronic pulse that was an exact forged copy of the German ghost signal. The night of the test was clear and brutally cold. They drove their truck to a high ridge, a place that had a clear line of sight into the valley where the farmhouse lay hidden. The forest around them was silent, the sky a canopy of hard, glittering stars. The risk was immense. If they were wrong, if there was a human operator at the other end, he would hear the clumsiness of their fake signal immediately. An alert would go out. At best, the Germans would change their entire system. At worst, a German artillery spotter would already be calculating the coordinates of their ridge. Withers attached his keyer to the transmitter. Shaw aimed their directional antenna toward the quiet valley. They were broadcasting directly at the presumed location of the enemy's central command. It felt like shouting into a sleeping giant's ear. Withers took a deep breath. His hand hovered over the switch. This was it, the culmination of weeks of obsessive listening, of being ignored, of being called a fool. He flicked the switch. There was no sound, just a faint hum from the transmitter and the flicker of a needle on a dial. For 5 seconds, they poured their counterfeit identity into the ether. A lie made of electrons traveling at the speed of light toward the enemy. Then, silence. Withers switched off the transmitter. He scrambled over to the listening station, clamping the headphones over his ears. Nothing, just the gentle, empty hiss of the airwaves. 1 minute passed.
Shaw chewed his lip, his eyes darting around the dark forest, as if expecting the trees to erupt in muzzle flashes. 2 minutes. The silence in the headphones was deafening. Withers felt a cold knot of failure tightening in his stomach. The captain had been right. It was a reflection, a ghost, a wild goose chase. He had risked everything for nothing. And then it happened. The hiss in his ears did not change. It was shattered. It was not one signal. It was a chorus. Bip, 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 from the north. Bip, 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 from the east. Another, fainter, from the south. Another, and another, and another. On his panoramic receiver, a dozen sharp peaks bloomed at once, all on the same frequency, all with the same perfect mechanical signature. Shaw saw the look on Withers' face and scrambled for the other set of headphones. His jaw dropped. It was the network, the whole vast, invisible thing. Their fake signal, their single, desperate query, had been received by the master machine in the farmhouse, and that machine, following its protocol, had automatically pulled its entire network for status reports. The ghost machine had been tricked, and in its response, it had given them everything. Every listening post, every sensor, every secret electronic eye the Germans had on the Western Front had just turned around and stared right back at them. The test was a success. The "it works" moment was not a small victory, it was a revelation. Withers, the quiet technician, had not just found a radio station, he had reached into the enemy's brain and made its nerves twitch. He now had proof that was undeniable, terrifying, and screaming at him through his headphones from a dozen different directions at once. Withers did not get a medal, he got a formal reprimand. He and Shaw brought the recording back to their captain, a wax disc that held the impossible chorus of the German network. They played it for him in the damp concrete bunker.
The sound that filled the small room was thin, scratchy, and utterly damning. A dozen identical machines, all speaking at once, from all across the front. It was the sound of a nervous system spasming. The captain listened, his face pale in the lamplight. He was not a technical man. He did not understand the physics, but he understood the implications. He understood the sound of a coordinated, disciplined network. And he understood that Withers, the quiet, eccentric sergeant he had dismissed as a fantasist, had found it. He also understood that his 2 men had flagrantly disobeyed a direct order. They had operated a transmitter without authorization, a cardinal sin in the world of signals intelligence, a move that could have compromised their entire unit. He was a man caught between the rulebook and a miracle. He looked at Withers, not with contempt, but with a new, unsettling kind of awe. He told him he was a fool, that he should be court-martialed. He said he had risked everything on a hunch. Then he picked up the telephone and made a call to Corps headquarters. He did not describe Withers' theory. He simply stated, in the flat, unemotional language of a military report, that his unit had recorded an unprecedented level of enemy signals traffic of an unknown type, and that he was bringing the recording and his specialist to the G2 intelligence section immediately. The boardroom was not a boardroom. It was the library of a requisitioned Belgian chateau, a room of dark wood paneling, faded tapestries, and the faint, sweet smell of old paper and stale cigar smoke. Maps covered the long oak table, a constellation of pins and grease pencil arrows. This was the brain of the Allied push into Germany, and it was a brain consumed by a single, agonizing problem: the mole. The men in the room were a mix of British and American officers, their uniforms a study in contrasting shades of khaki and olive drab. They were the architects of the intelligence war. At the head of the table sat a British colonel, a man named Bryce, the head of counterintelligence for this sector. He was a man carved from granite, with a clipped mustache and eyes that seemed to hold a permanent, wintry disapproval. He was the chief mole hunter, a man steeped in the classical, human traditions of espionage, of deception and betrayal. For weeks, his entire world had been a search for a single, treacherous man. Beside him sat an American major from the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. His name was Jensen. He was younger than the others, his uniform looked newer, and he had the restless, impatient energy of the New World. Where Bryce's world was one of established procedure and institutional memory, Jensen's was one of improvisation and asymmetric warfare. His agents were the ones dying. He was the one feeling the direct, lethal consequences of the intelligence blackout. Into this room of cold certainty and desperate urgency, Sergeant Alfred Withers was ushered, carrying his logbook and the wax disc like a holy relic. The captain made his report, carefully omitting the part about the illegal transmission. He simply said that Sergeant Withers had developed a novel technique for isolating the enemy signal. Then he stepped back, leaving Withers alone in the center of the room, a pale, stooping technician in a room of warriors. Withers began to speak, his voice soft, almost academic. He explained the timings. He described the inhuman precision of the transmissions. He laid out his theory, not of a single spy, but of a network, a machine. He pointed on the main map to the spot where all the lines of his triangulation converged. A farm, he said, a simple dairy farm in the Cal Valley. He believed it housed the central processing hub, an automated electronic brain that was collating signals intelligence from across the front. He finished. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the stone hearth. Colonel Bryce took a long, slow draw from his cigarette. He looked at Withers, not as an officer looks at a sergeant, but as a biologist might look at a curious insect. He did not seem angry. He seemed tired. He spoke, his voice layered with a weary, condescending patience. "Sergeant," he began, "I admire your technical diligence. It is, however, quite clear you are a technician, not an intelligence officer. What you have described, this fantastical electric brain, is the stuff of boys' adventure novels. It is not the reality of modern warfare." Bryce stood and walked to the map. He explained to Withers, as one might explain to a child, the concept of a Funkspiel, a radio game. He said the Germans were masters of deception. He theorized that the signal Withers had found was a brilliant, elaborate hoax, a ghost network designed to do exactly what it had done, distract Allied intelligence, to send them chasing phantoms in the static, while the real work was being done by human agents. The farmhouse, he declared, was almost certainly a decoy transmitter, a radio beacon designed to be found, to lead them on a wild goose chase. This was the system protecting itself. Bryce's entire career, his entire worldview, was built on the primacy of human intelligence. The idea that a machine, an algorithm, could be outthinking his network of spies and analysts was not just wrong, it was offensive. It was an insult to his profession. He saw Withers' theory as a dangerous fantasy, a distraction from the real, difficult work of finding the traitor in their midst. He dismissed Withers with a wave of his hand. "Thank you, Sergeant. That will be all. You may return to your duties." He turned back to the other officers, ready to resume the real business of the war. Withers stood frozen. He had presented his proof, the culmination of weeks of work, the greatest discovery of his life, and he had been dismissed, laughed at. He had been called a child. The system had not just rejected his idea, it had refused to even see it. But he was not alone. Major Jensen, the American, had been silent throughout the entire exchange, his eyes fixed on Withers. He had not looked at the colonel. He had looked at the technician. He had seen the raw, unshakable certainty in the man's eyes, and he had heard something in the recording that the others had missed. He had heard the sound of his own failure. He had heard the sound of the machine that was killing his men. He spoke, his voice quiet but carrying a sharp edge of command. "Colonel, I am not a radio expert, but I am an expert in dead agents. I have lost 12 men in the last month. 12. Not captured, not compromised, vanished. The Gestapo are not getting lucky. They are not just good. They are clairvoyant. The mole hunt has produced nothing, not a whisper. Forgive me, Sergeant," he said, turning to Withers, "but your theory, as strange as it sounds, is the first thing I have heard in 6 weeks that actually fits the facts." This was the advocate, the one man in the room whose desperation outweighed his skepticism. Bryce turned slowly to face Jensen, his eyes cold. "Major," he said, "your operational security is your own affair. Chasing this technician's fantasy is a dereliction of our duty. We have credible intelligence pointing to a leak inside the Belgian liaison mission. That is where we will focus our resources." The conflict was now open. It was the old world versus the new, the spy hunter versus the special operator. Bryce, the man of systems and procedures, saw Withers' theory as a threat to the established order. Jensen, the pragmatist, saw it as the only way out of a dead end. He argued, his voice rising with passion. He said that Bryce's credible intelligence had been wrong for 2 months. He said they were rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic while a German panzer army was, at this very moment, probably massing in the Ardennes behind a perfect wall of electronic security. He said he did not care if the signal was coming from a farmhouse, a spaceship, or the Kaiser's ghost. It was a lead. It was the only lead. The gamble had to be made. Jensen formally requested that a small reconnaissance team, a joint British-American patrol, be dispatched to observe the farmhouse. Not to attack it, just to look. To put a pair of human eyes on the source of this impossible signal. Bryce refused, flatly. He said he would not authorize a single man, a single bullet, or a single gallon of petrol for such a patently absurd mission. He declared the matter closed. He told the captain to take his sergeant and get back to his listening post. The system had won. The idea was dead. Withers felt a profound, sinking despair. He had failed. He turned to leave the room, his logbook feeling as heavy as lead in his hand. But as he reached the door, Major Jensen's voice cut through the air. "One moment, Sergeant." Withers stopped. Jensen did not look at Colonel Bryce. He looked at Withers. This was his damn the rules decision. He could not get official sanction. The system had blocked him, so he would go outside the system. He told Withers that while the colonel would not sanction a military operation, the OSS operated under a different, more flexible charter. He said he had a small team of specialists, men trained for exactly this kind of close target reconnaissance. They were not, strictly speaking, under SHAEF command. Colonel Bryce's face darkened. He warned Jensen that any such freelance operation would be a violation of their joint command agreement. He said that if it went wrong, Jensen would be on his own. There would be no support, no rescue. It would be a deniable operation in the truest sense of the word. Jensen nodded. He accepted the terms. He was making the gamble, not with the Army's resources, but with his own, with the lives of his own men. Then he looked directly at Withers, his quiet, awkward, brilliant sergeant. He said his team were good soldiers, but they were not radio men. They would not know what to look for. They would see a farmhouse and dismiss it. He needed someone who could see the invisible, someone who could look at a simple wire, a strange antenna, a diesel generator where none should be, and understand what it meant. He was not asking. He was telling. "Sergeant," he said, "pack your gear. You are coming with us." Alfred Withers, the man who had never fired a rifle in anger, the man whose entire war had been fought against static, had just been drafted into the most dangerous mission of his life. He was no longer a listener. He was now the scout, the guide, the one man who could lead a team of spies into the heart of the enemy's ghost machine. The gamble was on. He was going to the farmhouse. The journey to the farmhouse was a descent into a colder, quieter hell than Alfred Withers had ever known. They moved at night, a small, dark procession of ghosts against the snow. There were 4 of them, the OSS men, led by a quiet, lethal captain named Keen, a man who seemed to be made of the same hard, frozen earth as the forest itself. And then there was Withers. He was a piece of baggage, a fragile instrument wrapped in wool, struggling to keep up. His rifle, an American M1 carbine that Keen had pressed into his hands, felt alien and heavy, a clumsy tool for a man whose life was spent with calipers and soldering irons. The soldiers moved with a liquid grace, their bodies low, their senses tuned to the brittle language of the winter woods. Withers stumbled. He was a creature of the city, of warm, humming rooms filled with the scent of ozone. Here, the air was a blade. The silence was an entity, a predator, and his own labored breathing felt like a series of unforgivable explosions. Keen would periodically glide back to him, a shadow detaching from other shadows, and place a firm hand on his shoulder, not in comfort, but as a physical command to be quieter, to control the rattling of his teeth. They stopped before dawn, taking up a position on a wooded ridge that overlooked the Cal Valley. Below them, the world was a soft monochrome painting. A blanket of untouched snow covered rolling fields, traced with the dark lines of fences and the skeletal shapes of dormant trees. And there, in the center of it all, was the farmhouse. It was perfect. It was aggressively, maddeningly normal. It was a 2-story stone building with a steeply pitched slate roof, a large timber and stone barn attached to one side, and a collection of smaller outbuildings. A thin gray curl of wood smoke rose from its single chimney, a comforting, domestic plume that spoke of breakfast and warmth. As the light grew, they saw a figure emerge from the house, a man in a thick coat and boots. He was carrying 2 buckets. He walked to the well, worked the hand pump, and carried the sloshing buckets back inside. Later, he came out again and scattered feed for a handful of chickens pecking in the snow near the barn. This was the arrogant advance. The enemy's perfect weapon was not a fortress. It was a caricature of peace. It was a stage play of rural German life, performed with meticulous care, designed to be so utterly mundane that no military eye would ever give it a second glance. Keen lay beside Withers in the snow, the powerful lenses of his binoculars trained on the farm. He was silent for a long time. Then he lowered the glasses and turned to Withers, his breath frosting in the air. He said, "Sergeant, my boys are freezing their asses off on this hill. I see a farmer, a few chickens, and a chimney." He told Withers he hoped to God he was right about this, because if he was not, the post-mission report to Major Jensen was going to be extremely unpleasant. It was Colonel Bryce's skepticism, reborn on a frozen ridge, a soldier's simple, pragmatic doubt. This was the moment. The new, unlikely tactic. The weapon was not the rifle in Withers' hands. It was the mind behind his spectacles. He raised his own binoculars, his fingers numb, And he did not look at the farmer. He looked at the details. He looked past the performance to the stage itself. He started to speak, his voice a low, trembling whisper, a litany of anomalies. The chimney, he said, look at the smoke. It is too consistent, too clean. A wood fire breathes, it gusts. That is a coal fire. A furnace, perhaps. Why would a farmer need a furnace that runs this steadily? He directed Keen's gaze to the barn. He pointed to a small louvered vent near the foundation, almost completely hidden by a snow-covered woodpile. From it, a faint, almost invisible heat haze shimmered in the frigid air. Withers said it was the exhaust for a generator, a big one, a diesel. You can almost smell it, he whispered, the faint tang of unburnt fuel. It was a smell he knew intimately, the smell of the BBC's backup power units. Then he saw it, the thing that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. Strung between the corner of the house and a tall pole near the barn was a laundry line. It was dusted with snow, a perfect detail of domestic life. But it was wrong. The line did not sag. It was pulled taut, with the tension of a piano wire. The insulators, the small ceramic knobs where it attached to the house and the pole, were not the simple porcelain spools of a farmer's line. They were heavy, ribbed and brown, the kind used for high-power radio transmissions. And the line itself, Withers could see it now, was not rope. It was a thick, multi-strand copper aerial. It was a T-antenna, cleverly disguised as a place to hang washing. He pointed out another, a long wire antenna hidden along the peak of the barn's roof. He saw the thick, black, insulated cable, far heavier than any civilian electrical feed, that snaked down from the pole and disappeared into the ground, running toward the house. Keen stared through his binoculars, his focus shifting, his mind remapping the scene. He was no longer looking at a farm, he was looking at a machine. Withers had given him the key, the legend, and now he could see it. The whole placid valley was a lie. The farmhouse was a skull, and Withers had just shown him the faint, hairline cracks that betrayed its true nature. The tactic was proven, the gamble was real. Keen lowered his glasses, he looked at his men, and he gave a single, sharp nod. They went in at dusk. The world was draining of color, the snow turning a deep, bruised purple. The farmer had finished his chores. The lights in the farmhouse windows were a warm, inviting yellow. The assault was an act of silent, brutal poetry. Two of Keen's men detached, melting into the shadows around the barn to cover the rear. Keen and the fourth man, a giant corporal named Harris, moved toward the house itself. Withers was ordered to stay with them, to stay low, to touch nothing. His job was done. Now the soldiers would do theirs. The approach was a crawl, a painful, freezing journey across the open ground of the farmyard. The smell of manure and hay was thick in the air. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic chugging of the generator Withers had predicted, a low, mechanical heartbeat coming from within the barn. They reached the main door of the house. Keen did not try the handle. He simply gestured to Harris. The big corporal took a step back and drove his boot into the wood just beside the lock. The sound of splintering timber was a gunshot in the silent evening. Keen was through the door before the pieces had finished falling. The bafflement was instantaneous. The confusion was total. The first room was not a kitchen. It was not a cozy farmhouse parlor. It was an airlock. A small, sterile antechamber, its walls bare plaster, its floor clean concrete. Another heavy, insulated steel door stood before them. There was a strange smell in the air. It was not the smell of cooking, but the dry, electric smell of hot machinery. They breached the second door, and the world turned inside out. They had stepped from a 19th century German farm into the 21st. The room was vast, occupying the entire ground floor of the farmhouse. The interior walls had been removed. It was a space of profound, organized chaos, a temple dedicated to the invisible, and it was alive. Banks of machinery stood in long, neat rows, their metal cases painted a sterile gray. Hundreds of vacuum tubes glowed with a soft orange light, like rows of votive candles. On one wall, a vast map of the Western Front was covered in a sheet of clear perspex, and behind it, a complex web of wires and small bulbs blinked in hypnotic, cascading patterns. Reels of magnetic tape spun on large, open-faced machines, their movements silent and precise. Nothing was loud, but the entire room hummed. It was the sound of a million calculations, of a vast electronic intelligence deep in thought. And in the middle of it all were the priests, 3 men. They were not soldiers. They were dressed in gray sweaters and trousers. One wore spectacles, just like Withers. They had been sitting at a console, and now they were on their feet, their faces masks of pure, bloodless shock. Their perfect, secret world, their clean, quiet laboratory of war, had just been breached by brutes carrying guns. One of them, a thin man with receding hair, made a lurching move toward a large red button on the main console, a thermite charge designed to incinerate the entire system. He never made it. Keened carbine coughed once, a dry, flat sound that was shockingly loud in the humming room. The man collapsed in a heap, a small, dark stain spreading across his gray sweater. The other 2 froze, their hands shooting into the air, their eyes wide with the terror of academics confronted with a violence they had only ever processed as data points on a map. The panic was over as quickly as it had begun. The enemy, the men who ran the ghost machine, were not warriors, they were clerks. This was the climax. The title validation. This was what they could not believe. Keene and Harris secured the 2 remaining technicians, their movements swift and professional. They saw a room full of enemy radio equipment, a prize beyond imagining. But it was Withers who understood. He stepped into the room, his carbine held forgotten at his side. He was trembling, not with fear, but with a kind of ecstatic, horrified reverence. He walked past the OSS men, his eyes scanning the racks of equipment. He was home. This was his language. He put his hand on the warm metal casing of one of the receiver banks. He explained, his voice hushed, almost breathless, what they were looking at. These were not just radios. These were panoramic intercept receivers, dozens of them, all linked together. They were not listening to one frequency at a time. They were listening to all of them, every Allied frequency, from the platoon commander's walkie-talkies to the air command channels, all at once. He pointed to the spinning tape reels. He said they were recording everything, every transmission. But the real brain, he said, the miracle, the thing he had only half believed was possible, was over there. He led them to a towering rack of machinery at the far end of the room. It clicked and whirred, and a steady stream of rectangular cards, perforated with thousands of tiny holes, dropped from a hopper into a sorting tray. It was a Hollerith machine, a punch card computer. Withers stared at it, his mouth agape. He explained that the machine was not just listening, it was thinking. It was cross-referencing every transmission with a library of known data. It was analyzing call signs, transmission lengths, operator fists, and triangulated positions from its remote listening posts. It was an automated traffic analysis system on a scale that Allied intelligence did not believe existed. It was the machine that had caught the Belgian railway workers. It had heard their faint signal, compared it to its library of known resistance transmissions, and in a matter of seconds had placed them on the big map on the wall. A light would have blinked, and the Gestapo would have been dispatched. It was the mole. The mole was a machine, a brilliant, inhuman, and terrifyingly efficient machine. Alfred Withers, the quiet radio sergeant from the BBC, stood in the heart of the enemy's brain. He had been right. His stupid idea, his obsession with a ghost in the static, had led them here. He had followed the signal, and at the end of it, he had found the secret to the entire war on the Western Front, humming quietly to itself in the warm electric air of a German farmhouse. The unimaginable was real. The theory was a fact. The tactic, the one of bringing the right man instead of the right weapon, had been proven, decisively, in a room that smelled of hot metal and ozone. The system was not just compromised, it had been found. The first reaction was silence. Not the silence of a forest at dusk, but a dead, artificial silence that screamed its wrongness across 100 different channels. In a concrete bunker 50 miles behind the lines, a German Oberst of the Nachrichtenaufklärung, the signals intelligence branch, took off his headphones and stared at the banks of receivers. His entire world, the vast, invisible web he had spent 2 years building, had just gone dark. The heartbeats were gone. The network, his perfect, clairvoyant machine, was not reporting in. It was a failure so total, so instantaneous, that it did not compute. His first thought was a catastrophic power failure, a generator blown at the central hub. Then, a direct hit from a stray bomber, an accident of impossible odds. He dispatched a motorcycle courier to the Cow Valley with an urgent message, an act that felt archaic, like sending a messenger on horseback. By the next morning, the silence had been replaced by a storm. The reports that came in were not electronic, but human, panicked and bleeding. A fuel depot, its location changed just 12 hours before, had been obliterated by a squadron of typhoons that appeared out of the low clouds with unerring, murderous precision. A reserve panzer company, moving up to the front under cover of darkness, was ambushed and annihilated by tank destroyers that were waiting for them, dug in at the exact crossroads they intended to use. On the Allied radio nets, the chatter had changed. The call signs were different. The frequencies were shifting in a new, complex pattern. The Allies were not just talking again, they were shouting, confident and secure. The curtain of German omniscience had not just been parted, it had been torn down and set on fire. The courier did not return. A patrol sent to the farmhouse found it cold and empty. They found the splintered door, the spent cartridge case on the floor of the humming, silent room. They found the body of the technician, and the wires that led to the thermite charges, neatly, expertly cut. The machine was intact, but it was lobotomized. The core processing unit, the punch card collator, was gone. The magnetic tape reels had been taken. The logbooks had vanished. It was not a bombing. It was a burglary, a heist, a surgical strike so precise and so impossibly well informed that the Oberst, reading the report, felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the advancing Allied armies. They had not just destroyed his machine, they had stolen its soul. His after-action report was a masterpiece of bureaucratic confusion. It spoke of an enemy action of unknown type, conducted by a force of unknown size, using methods that were, as of yet, undetermined. The truth was simpler. The perfect weapon had been defeated because its creators had never imagined an enemy like Alfred Withers. They had built a wall of electronic steel, never considering someone might simply listen for the echo, find the one loose brick, and walk right through. Withers himself never saw the Colonel's chateau again. His debriefing was conducted by Major Jensen in a cold Nissen hut near a muddy airfield. For 2 days, he sat with American and British engineers, men like himself, their faces alight with a kind of holy wonder as he explained the schematics of the German machine. He drew diagrams from memory, describing the punch card system, the panoramic receivers, the automated cross-referencing. He was no longer a sergeant. He was a professor, a high priest of a captured religion, explaining the mysteries of the enemy's god. Jensen tried to put him in for a medal. The recommendation, a detailed and laudatory account of Sergeant Withers' unique intellectual contribution to a mission of vital strategic importance, made its way to Colonel Bryce's desk. It was quietly lost. The official record could not accommodate the truth. The official story remained the one the system could accept. The intelligence blackout had been the work of a sophisticated German deception campaign that was ultimately overcome by conventional counterintelligence. The farmhouse was a footnote, its contents classified at a level so high it effectively ceased to exist. There could be no medal for a mission that had never happened. The hero's quiet life began almost immediately. Withers was transferred from the front, sent back to a signals intelligence depot in the south of England, a place of quiet routine and endless paperwork.
When the war in Europe ended, he received his discharge papers, a travel warrant back to London, and a handshake from his commanding officer. He went home. He returned to Alexandra Palace, to the BBC, to his old workbench with its familiar scent of solder and hot vacuum tubes. His colleagues asked him what he did in the war, and he said he was in the signals, listening. He did not speak of the frozen forest, or the humming room, or the look in the technician's eyes. These were ghosts that belonged to a different world, a different man. He went back to his life's work, to the struggle against static and signal drift. He married, had children, and grew old, a quiet, stooping man with a maddening habit of staring into the middle distance, as if listening for a conversation no one else could hear. He was a man who had held the secret of the Battle of the Bulge in his logbook, and then went back to making sure the evening news went out on time. The system had ignored him, used him, and then forgotten him, which was, he often thought, the most efficient outcome of all. The moral of the farmhouse is not that the man is more important than the machine. The moral is that the right man is a weapon the machine can never understand. The German system was a technological marvel, a work of cold, logical genius. Its failure was not technological. It was a failure of imagination. Its creators, the brilliant technicians in their gray sweaters, believed in the infallibility of their logic. They could not conceive of an enemy who would ignore the message and listen to the silence in between. They could not imagine a mind like Alfred Withers. Likewise, the Allied system, the world of Colonel Bryce, was a failure of imagination. It was built on a doctrine of human conflict, of spies and traitors, of motives and betrayals. The Colonel was looking for a reflection of himself, a human adversary playing by the same ancient rules. The possibility that the enemy was not a man, but an idea, an algorithm made of wire and glass, was a truth his doctrine could not contain. He was blinded by his own expertise. The established solution for both sides was a suicide pact with their own assumptions. The Germans assumed their secrecy was perfect. The Allies assumed their enemy was human. Both were wrong. The breakthrough came from the man who was not a soldier, not a spy, but a specialist. A man who carried not a rifle, but a question. Withers' real weapon was not the illegal transmitter he built in the back of a truck. It was his obsessive, uncredentialed curiosity. He was the unlikely hero because his mind worked on a different frequency from everyone else's. He proved that the most important person on the battlefield is not always the one with the gun, but the one who can see the pattern that everyone else has dismissed as noise. And this is the full circle. The unauthorized idea became the new faith. The contents of the farmhouse, the stolen schematics, the captured technicians, and Sergeant Withers' debriefing were not lost. They were the seed. In the quiet, hidden laboratories of the post-war world, in places like Bletchley Park and Arlington Hall, a revolution began. The captured German machine was not just studied, it was revered, it was copied, it was improved. The ghost in the machine that Withers had hunted became the foundation of a new kind of intelligence. The Allies had been fighting a war of messages focused on the content of enemy transmissions. The farmhouse taught them to fight a war of signals. They learned to map the entire electronic battlefield, to analyze not just what was being said, but who was talking to whom, how often, and from where. The science of traffic analysis, of sifting through the metadata of a billion transmissions to find the one crucial pattern, was born in that room of humming vacuum tubes. The unauthorized theory of the quiet sergeant is now the central guiding doctrine of the modern surveillance state. Every signal, every pulse, every whisper in the ether is considered a piece of a larger puzzle. The descendants of the farmhouse are the vast, silent listening posts of the National Security Agency and GCHQ. They are the server farms that inhale the world's data, the algorithms that hunt for anomalies, the analysts who stare at screens looking for the faint electronic signature of a threat.
Alfred Withers' jury-rigged test, his forged call sign sent out into the darkness to provoke a response, is now a standard technique, a fundamental tool of electronic warfare. The idea of fooling a network, of making the enemy's own system reveal itself, is no longer a desperate gamble. It is a chapter in the manual. The technician's fantasy is now a multi-billion-dollar industry. The ultimate legacy of the Farmhouse is this. The war of whispers that Alfred Withers and Corporal Shaw fought in the Hürtgen Forest never ended. It just went silent. It became a permanent, invisible, and humming feature of the modern world. The battle between the signal and the listener, between the code and the key, between the ghost and the machine designed to see it, is fought every day, in rooms that look remarkably like the one they found at the end of their hunt. The quiet technician, the man the system ignored, did not just find the enemy's brain. He drew the blueprint for the future.